Markets bounce back as the U.S. and China hit pause. Trump's tariffs have been talked down from their 145% highs with a 90-day hiatus on the most severe levies. But will the lower rate satisfy consumers and prevent global economic decline? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is U.S.-China trade. The economic turbulence of the last 4 months has caused most everyone some level of stress or even anxiety. The ups and downs were best reflected in global markets that crashed back in April, but bounced back to pre-trade war levels this week. That's, of course, when the U.S. and China announced a lowering of record-breaking tariffs to take effect for the next 3 months. But is any sense of relief really justified if the pause is only partially fixing something that was deliberately broken? Here's a look now at the U.S.-China trade relationship.
In today's trade-driven world, no rivalries match the ongoing economic clash between the US and China. In his first term, President Trump accused China of intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and unfair trade practices. He imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, while Beijing hit back with its own tariffs. Under President Joe Biden, the tone toward China might have become more measured, but the policy didn't change. Tariffs stayed in place, and for some Chinese-made goods, they were even raised. In this, his second term, President Trump has continued to accuse China of unfair trade practices, raising tariffs to an eye-watering 145%, while China hit back with 125% levies. The result has been immediate: supply chains disrupted, costs of goods increasing, and global markets in turmoil.
There are no winners in tariff wars and trade wars. Bullying and tyranny will only isolate oneself.
But now a truce has emerged. Coming into effect on Wednesday, a pause in the ongoing battle. It follows meetings in Geneva between US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and China's Vice Premier He Lifeng. They agreed to cut US tariffs to 30% and Chinese tariffs to 10%, at least for 90 days.
In addition, yesterday we achieved a total reset with China after productive talks in Geneva. Both sides now agreed to reduce the tariffs imposed after April 2nd to 10% for 90 days as negotiators continue on the larger structural issues. And I want to tell you that a couple of things. First of all, that doesn't include the tariffs that are already on, that are our tariffs, and it doesn't include tariffs on cars, steel, aluminum, things such as that, or tariffs that may be imposed on pharmaceuticals, because we want to bring the pharmaceutical businesses back to the United States, and they're already starting to come back now based on tariffs.
This is not a full trade deal, just a careful temporary reset. The US will lower tariffs on some consumer goods and allow limited exports of mid-level silicon chips. In return, China promised to be more open about government subsidies and to fight intellectual property theft. The deal is cautious and comes with many conditions, but it's the first tariff reduction in years. Some economists think it might calm the markets, while others say it's just a short break in the bigger fight for economic dominance. The US-China rivalry over trade, tech and power is clearly not going away anytime soon, but for now, the trade issue has moved into a new phase, one of conflict and cooperation.
So can this trade peace hold, and what will be the real implications of tariff hikes, even if they are lower than initially announced? Well, joining me now to debate that and much more are from Beijing, President of the Center for China and Globalization and former counselor with the China State Council, Huiyao Wang. From Pennsylvania, head of research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program, Robert E. Hamilton. And from Kaohsiung, Taiwan, economist and senior fellow at the Bruegel think tank, Alicia Garcia Herrero. Thanks all so much for being with me. Alicia, I'll start with you. How much do you think this 90-day pause has normalized or stabilized the global economy, and for how long?
Well, it has certainly helped avoid a global recession, if you ask me, and that is really good news. It has also helped avoid inflation pressures in the US and deflation pressures in China. So, it's a good start. But I don't think US China strategic competition is over. What is probably over is very high tariffs because neither of the two can afford them for the reasons I mentioned, nor can the world. So, in that regard, I think the question is what is next? What kind of pressure comes next? Is it investment? Is it technology? Is it people to people exchanges? But I do think the strategic competition and the pressure from both sides will continue.
Okay. Interesting, though, Alicia, I'll stick with you for a second because, yeah, very high tariffs, as you put it, are now off the table. Still, 30% is very considerable. I mean, is that good enough? Or is it just, are we measuring it now by kind of the shock value of the drop from 145 to 30? Still not considering how high 30% really is.
Absolutely. We estimated the impact on the Chinese economy to be 1.7 percentage points of GDP less growth. This means that it is still significant. And it also means that I'm sure China will try to reduce these tariffs, perhaps the fentanyl-related tariffs, the 20% tariffs, further down, because it's still a shock for China and it's still a shock for the US. But again, tariffs are only part of the picture here. We can't forget that. There is other things that may come that can be very painful. It could be the dollar. It could be, a sell-off in the US Treasury market. It could be things that are still very, very worrisome for the global economy. We're not over.
Right. Henry, how much do you agree there?
Well, I think that, I think Alicia was largely right. I think that there's some structural competition probably still there. But I think actually this time the tariff war has been greatly reduced and suspended also for 90 days. It's a great experiment and also a great test of how we are globally connected, how we are really intertwined, and we cannot separate from each other basically. And also once President Trump launched this trade war, and he realized he's hurting his own company. I mean, he immediately released also, for about 100 billion US dollar goods that are actually conducted by multinationals of US, basically Apple's, Tesla, Walmart, and you name it, lots of them. So, and also there's a many middle part in that is also the US industry is heavily dependent on. So and also the port are really getting really slowing down, and that's going to affect Christmas, Thanksgiving, shopping, holiday seasons. It's going to make a supermarket shelf empty. That scenario is going to do greater damage. President Trump's initial vision to make America great again, and he will be the economic prosperity president. So. Quickly, I think the administration realized that, and then they stopped escalating. And also, of course, for China too. I mean, we don't want to have a trade war to fight with U.S. China has always said they don't want a war. They always want to open doors wide open. But if they are forced to, they have to fight it. So I think this time, we all realize that we are so much intertwined. It's not 19th century, 20th century. It's 21st century. It's totally different now. I mean. WTO 30 years ago is $5 trillion total trade. Now it's 30 years later, the whole world, we had a 33 trillion total trade. We cannot really just go back to the old days. So we have some rationality at working now for both governments.
Okay, well, let me ask Robert then this. So it's stopped escalating, at least for now, but in the United States, with such a purely capitalist economy, how dangerous is just the volatility alone?
Yeah, the volatility is very dangerous. Business loves certainty and hates uncertainty. And so, what you've seen in these two rounds of sort of tariff wars that the U.S. That the Trump administration has launched, the first against a large number of allies and partners across the world, which in April we rolled back because money started to flee the U.S. Bond market, started to flee U.S. treasuries, which had always been a safe haven in times of economic uncertainty. But in this case, the uncertainty was caused by the Trump administration. So they paused those for 90 days. And then in this case, the China tariffs, which we had escalated to 145%, and China escalated sort of not to that level, but every step the U.S. escalated, China escalated as well. You started to see shipping traffic between China and the U.S. dry up, and you started to see port managers in U.S. Western ports saying, I've got nothing inbound for the next 30 days. And so it was clear that we needed a pause. I think the U.S. needed a pause in this trade war that it began. And so it's a 90-day pause. But then the question, back to your original question, Andrea, about certainty, we have to see what happens at the end of 90 days. I don't think many businesses are going to make many long-term decisions, assuming these tariffs will stay at lower levels, because it's unpredictable what the U.S. will do when this 90-day clock expires.
Yeah, again, you mentioned lower levels. Robert, quickly, I mean, just as an American, how are you feeling about 30% tariffs on everyday goods for consumers?
Well, of course, most Americans understand that tariffs are taxes. Ultimately, these are paid by the consumer. Some businesses, the larger businesses with wider profit margins or larger profit margins, may try in the interim to eat the cost of tariffs and avoid passing them on directly to consumers. But the longer they remain in place, whether it's 145% or 30%, at some point, most or all of that gets passed on to consumers by the businesses that survive. Smaller businesses, startups, and businesses with lower capitalization, they may not be able to survive. Certainly, they wouldn't survive a 145% tariff on products if they import products from China as part of their business. It remains to be seen whether they would survive a 30% tariff. Probably some will and others won't.
Mm-hmm. Alisa, let me ask you this. I mean, beyond the world's two biggest economies, some had said that the adversarial China-U.S. relationship could provide an opportunity, particularly to Europe, to build maybe a better relationship with China, to offset its dependence, whatever there is on the U.S. But you don't, however, think that would be a good idea for the EU. Why is that? Why isn't this an opportunity for EU, China, and other partners?
Well, I mean, we already have a very deep relation with China. We happen to have €1 billion trade deficit a day, just to give you a sense of where we stand. A free trade agreement, if this is what we're talking about, a formal improvement with a free trade agreement, would barely improve Europe's access to the Chinese market. It didn't improve the US access to the Chinese market after the phase one deal. And this is basically because China is now so competitive for many reasons we could discuss, but the point is that China needs to export its way out. So it's very hard, even with the free trade agreement, to manage to export to China. In fact, European exports to China have been shrinking, not increasing. So has foreign direct investment. So I think, I'm not saying we should not trade and invest in China, but I don't think we would necessarily benefit from a closer, more formal free trade agreement. Simply because we're not gaining at the current juncture for years already from that relation. That doesn't mean we should stop the relation, though. That's a very different issue.
Right. So, Henry, not stop it, but if the EU as well becomes less dependent on Chinese imports, where does that leave China?
Well, I think that the EU is really already has this trade war has already pushed the two sides closer. We just had the President Xi and President von der Leyen and also European leaders exchange greeting messages, and then they have also lifted the sanctions that they had a few years ago on each other, parliamentary members, and also we have seen a number of high-level European leaders visiting China. And of course, also the business of European companies are so heavily involved on China, and then there's a possibility they can work together to invest back into Europe as well. So, so now I think this is the Trump's approach is really on the world's race. He wants to reset basically global trading system, and that probably needs China, EU, even Japan, Australia, Canada, and Mexico all working together to really not to really shake too much upside down the system, but rather we can improve it, enhance it. Well, it's not perfect, but of course, but we should not really totally reset the system. So what I think that Europe can actually now coming out of this, they need more. I mean, China can help mediating Russian war in Ukraine, and also help on the Middle East. And so there's more to work together now. In addition to the trade deal, there's a peace deal. China can work with US, with EU. So this representing also a large number of BRICS countries, they can really play active role in terms of resetting this multipolar world, new structure in the future. But of course, we're in that process. Everybody's trying different plan, and certainly Trump tried a big one. But I think we need to follow step by step and great consultations among each other. And I think this time it made us more probably united in terms of safeguarding world peace and prosperity. I'm glad the Trump administration realized that, and then they did the same. So we hope that the 90 days will make even more progress. I think the 20% fentanyl can be easily dropped, because that was made a lot of progress during the Biden administration. Biden administration official already said that China is working well with Homeland Security, and death rate of fentanyl of U.S. dropped 30% almost last year. So it's in the right direction. We just need a further clarification and focus more on the cartels and those gangsters that making fentanyl drugs. So we can work together on that.
Okay. Robert, let me ask you, though. I mean, yeah, Trump, as Henry said, Trump wants this reset. And the U.S. wants this decoupling, from dependence on the Chinese economy, basically. I mean, is the U.S. getting the decoupling it wants here? And with that decoupling, is there a geopolitical risk with China, in a sense, maybe feeling freer to really go its own way on military strategy, for example? Perhaps Taiwan. Where do you see that?
Sure. So I'm not sure the U.S., even the Trump administration, wants a full decoupling from economic decoupling between the U.S. and China. The Biden administration kept talking about guardrails and floors in the relationship, but the economic component of the relationship has always been sort of the stabilizer or the shock absorber, just because both countries are so dependent upon one another. China is dependent upon access to the U.S. market, and the U.S. is dependent upon the import of relatively cheap Chinese goods for U.S. consumers. So there's a mutual dependency, as well as China is a major investor in U.S. Treasury bonds. It's not the largest, but it's nevertheless a big one. And so this is a case where it is a positive sum interaction, mostly on the economic side, offset increasingly negative set of interactions and competition, even confrontation in the security realm. So my sense is that decoupling could be dangerous. You mentioned, Andrea, the idea that China would be sort of freer to pursue its territorial ambitions in the Indo-Pacific if it didn't have the stabilizer of the economic relationship with the U.S. So both sides, I think it would exacerbate the security competition between them by removing a pretty significant economic shock absorber. When security ties get really bad, both sides understand that the economic relationship is still worth preserving.
Interesting. I just need to ask you quickly, Robert. I mean, I want to know from a U.S. perspective, you being in the country, China has repeatedly said there are no winners in a trade war. But how is Trump portraying this, especially with this 90-day pause and then the lowering of these tariffs? Is he portraying it as a win? Are the optics good for him now?
So the White House is portraying the recent agreement with China as a win. In the same way, they've been portraying all these tariff policies as wins. In actuality, I think it is probably a correct perspective that nobody wins a trade war. And so you have to ask yourself, what's the intent of these tariffs? And here the Trump administration has been a little inconsistent or even incoherent in explaining why they've levied these tariffs. On one hand, sometimes they say we're going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. We're going to reshore manufacturing. On the other hand, they'll say, well, we need these tariffs as leverage to get other countries to make policy changes that are in the U.S. interest. Some of those are economic policy changes, tariffs of their own, market access in China's case, and some of them are non-economic policy changes. But those two things are in competition with each other, because if you use them as leverage for another country and the other country then makes the policy change the U.S. wants, the U.S. lifts the tariff, then businesses are not going to reshore. So business needs to know that these tariffs are going to be in place for years to make it worthwhile for them to reshore a lot of the manufacturing that they've offshored. And it's just not clear they're going to be in place for years.
Right. I mean, Alicia, I imagine you agree there. It's universally known that businesses need some certainty. They need to know what to invest in, what products to order in the longer term. So once these 90 days expire, what should we expect?
I don't think the Trump administration can increase the tariffs again. So we have to think of either stable 30% tariffs or lower tariffs, maybe 10%. But here the key is that nobody trusts the future anymore, and investment is not going to do well, which is a major part of growth in any country, whether it's the US or China. So this is basically the ultimate result of all of this, is that even if the tariffs are lifted, the world does not go back to zero. The harm has been done. And I would add, and I finish here, that unfortunately for Trump, I mean, he's lost all the credibility he could ever. The reason that was explained is that he's literally obliterated his economic leverage, let alone his economic deterrence, because Trump also used tariffs in front of the BRICS supposed attempt to de-dollarize, or even on Taiwan, tariffs that we now know he cannot hold. So he's lost a lot of credibility with this move.
Okay. Let me ask Henry a final question. We only have a few minutes left. As far as globalization is concerned then, and the fact that the United States wants an entirely new model for the global economy, one that's far more isolationist in many ways, is globalization as we've known it, is it over?
No, I don't think so, because I do think that globalization does have some problem. As always, for many things, nothing is perfect. But globalization is probably the most sure thing for safeguarding peace and prosperity. For example, you see when this trade was launched, I mean, there's 100 billion, even 200 billion, or even more, that U.S. business already intertwined in China. For example, I see a Chinese ambassador, Xie Feng, said that in Washington, that last year U.S. sells more than Chinese company selling in the U.S. The U.S. multinationals sell locally in China 400 billions. That's almost equal to the trade deficit that on the export basis. So you see, it depends how you calculate, that U.S. is getting advantage of service trade on the investment, on the U.S. dollar as a settlement currency, big time harvest global talents. 30% of AI talents in the U.S. coming from China. So U.S. just can't win on everything, and also, of course, all of the things manufacturing that the U.S. got rid of that are dirty, heavy-duty, labor-intensive, environmental unfriendly, was deliberate to get all of that, and then pass on to labor-intensive countries like China. Now China pass on to ASEAN, to Vietnam, not just a natural process. It's not, no American wants to work for this kind of work anymore. So, that's a process. But I do think the globalization, this wave, first started the U.S., impacted Europe, and then Japan, Australia, and China, ASEAN, and Africa. So that's a natural wave. But just how we can better actually manage that.
Okay.
80 years ago, a UN system established. We're growing out of that suit now. The old clothing is not fit the new person anymore. So let's really adjust that, retailor but not remake.
Okay.
Or really, we need to start over again.
Robert, a quick half minute for your thoughts on that.
I think we're in an era of retrenchment. I don't think globalization is over. We see politically and economically, if you look, over the long sweep of history, areas of greater integration and then areas of greater time periods of greater retrenchment. So look, we're in a period of democratic retrenchment. We're in a period of liberal economic integration, retrenchment there. I do think it will pass. I hope it will pass without conflict, but I think we will get back to an era of greater openness, liberalization, democratization, and economic integration.
Okay, Robert, that will have to be the final word. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for being with us and sharing your insights. And thanks to our viewers as well for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.